The building stood quietly that night, as it always had. Its lights were on. Its corridors were intact. Nothing appeared broken. Nothing appeared disturbed. According to the official record, nothing unusual had occurred. And yet, something had clearly gone wrong. The location would later be described as ordinary. A residential complex with functioning security cameras, controlled access points, and people who were present before and after the incident. On paper, it was the kind of place where answers should have been easy to find. But from the very beginning, this case refused to behave like a simple one. A young artist was found dead. The explanation arrived quickly. The paperwork was completed. The conclusion was delivered with confidence. For many, that should have been the end of the story. It was not. Because, even in the absence of new evidence, a quiet discomfort began to spread. Not outrage, not panic. Something slower and more difficult to dismiss. A sense that the story, as it had been told, did not fully align with what people felt in their bodies when they read it. The details were clean, but the silence surrounding them was not. Those who had known him described a person who kept to himself. Gentle, polite, careful with words. In an industry defined by excess, he seemed almost out of place. He did not chase attention, and attention rarely chased him. His public image was free of scandal. His private life, by most accounts, was disciplined and quiet, which made the questions harder to ignore. Why were there no clear eyewitness accounts? Why did those closest to the scene offer nothing beyond rehearsed statements? Why did a place designed to observe everything appear to remember so little? We are not here to accuse. We are not here to invent villains. We are here because in certain cases, uncertainty itself becomes the most important fact. As days passed, grief expanded beyond those who had ever met him. Strangers across cities and borders reacted with a level of sorrow that surprised even themselves. They could not explain why this loss felt personal. They only knew that it did. Perhaps it was because he represented something increasingly rare. A figure who seemed unprotected by cynicism. Or perhaps it was because his absence arrived without explanation, leaving behind a space that logic could not fill. When official narratives close too quickly, silence does not always mean resolution. Sometimes it means pressure. Sometimes it means that speaking carries a cost no one is willing to pay. We began to ask a different kind of question. Not who was responsible, but what conditions allow a story like this to end without answers. What systems encourage restraint? What fears convince people that saying nothing is safer than telling the truth? Because if the truth was truly simple, the silence surrounding this case would never have lasted this long. If the truth was truly simple, the silence surrounding this case would never have lasted this long. In every industry that depends on public admiration, silence has value. In the entertainment world, it has a price. From the outside, the system appears vibrant and expressive. Artists speak through performances, interviews, music, and carefully curated moments of authenticity. But behind that visibility exists a quieter structure, one governed not by inspiration, but by agreements, expectations, and invisible lines that are rarely crossed without consequence. For an individual working within this environment, freedom is conditional. Contracts do not simply outline professional obligations. They shape behavior. They define what may be said, when it may be said, and more importantly, what must remain unsaid. Reputation is treated as currency. Access is treated as privilege. And privilege, once lost, is almost never restored. Those who thrive learn this early. The artist at the center of this story did not appear rebellious. He did not challenge the system openly. If anything, he seemed to navigate it with caution. He kept his public presence measured. He avoided controversy. He spoke when required and retreated when permitted. To observers, this restraint looked like professionalism. But restraint over time can become something else. We must be careful here. Silence does not automatically imply coercion. Many choose it willingly. Some believe it is necessary. Others convince themselves that enduring pressure quietly is a form of strength. In industries where opportunity is scarce and competition is constant, compliance is often reframed as survival. Yet patterns matter. In the aftermath of his death, those patterns became difficult to ignore. Individuals who had interacted with him in the days and hours surrounding the incident did not contradict one another. But neither did they provide clarity. Statements were brief. Language was neutral. Emotional content was minimal. Each response felt carefully contained, as if shaped by the same unspoken boundaries. This uniformity raised a question that no official document addressed. Not whether people were lying, but whether they were unable to speak freely at all. Silence in such cases functions as a form of protection. Not always for the powerful, often for the vulnerable. To speak out can mean isolation, professional exile, or the quiet disappearance that leaves no formal record but effectively ends a career. The risk is rarely stated outright. It does not need to be. Everyone understands it. We began to consider the psychological burden this creates. Living within a system where one must constantly measure words. Where emotional honesty is permitted only in controlled settings. Where expressing doubt can be interpreted as disloyalty. Over time, this environment erodes internal boundaries. Individuals learn to compartmentalize. Public identity and private experience drift apart. What is shown becomes performative. What is felt remains unacknowledged. For some, this division is manageable. For others, it becomes unbearable. The industry does not require malicious intent to cause harm. It operates efficiently through incentives and fear. No single decision appears cruel. No single person appears responsible. But the cumulative effect can be devastating, especially for those whose personalities do not align with constant self-promotion and emotional armor. Those who knew him often described a sense of quiet fatigue. Not exhaustion from work alone, but from the continuous effort of containment. From never fully relaxing. From never being entirely off stage. And when something finally breaks, the system responds predictably. It closes ranks. It reduces complexity. It favors conclusions that allow operations to continue uninterrupted. We see this pattern repeated across industries and cultures. Tragedy occurs. Explanations are offered. Time passes. Attention shifts. The silence becomes normalized. But in this case, normalization did not occur. The public reaction suggested that something in this silence felt wrong, even to those with no direct connection to the individual. Perhaps it was the speed with which the narrative settled. Perhaps it was the absence of contradiction. Or perhaps it was the recognition of a dynamic many had experienced in their own lives, though on a smaller scale. The pressure to remain quiet. The instinct to comply. The fear of becoming inconvenient. We are not suggesting that silence confirms guilt or concealment. We are suggesting that silence, when shared by many, often indicates the presence of a force stronger than personal choice. In environments governed by reputation, silence is rarely accidental. It is learned. It is reinforced. and eventually it becomes reflexive. Which brings us to the detail that changed the direction of this case. Not a document, not a confession, but something small enough to be dismissed at first glance. A moment that did not fit neatly into the controlled narrative. A detail most people would never notice. And yet, once seen, it refused to disappear. Sometimes silence is not the absence of truth. It is the evidence of pressure. The detail that redirected attention did not emerge from an official statement or a sealed report. It appeared quietly, embedded in something familiar. Something designed to be heard, not scrutinized. A recording. At first, there was nothing unusual about it. A performance delivered months earlier. A song that had already circulated widely. Its lyrics were known. Its melody had been analyzed countless times by fans for emotional nuance rather than factual significance. No one had reason to believe it contained anything beyond artistic expression. Until someone listened more closely. When the audio was slowed, replayed, and compared to the original lyrics, a subtle discrepancy surfaced. One word did not sound as expected. The difference was slight. Phonetically similar, easy to overlook. But linguistically, the shift altered the meaning of the line in a way that could not be ignored. In its original form, the lyric expressed acceptance. A passive acknowledgement of circumstances beyond control. In the altered pronunciation, the sentence became something else entirely. It suggested restriction, a lack of agency, an inability to decide one's own future. The distinction was delicate but profound. From a technical standpoint, such variations can occur naturally. Fatigue, accent, artistic interpretation. These explanations were reasonable, and many accepted them immediately. But others hesitated. Not because they wanted to believe in hidden messages, but because the change aligned too closely with the questions already surrounding the case. We must be precise here. A single altered word does not constitute evidence. It does not prove intent. It does not confirm distress. But context matters. And context transforms coincidence into inquiry. The artist had no history of improvising lyrics during live performances. His delivery was typically controlled, rehearsed, and consistent. Deviations were rare. When they occurred, they were usually corrected immediately. This instance was different. The altered phrasing remained. That fact alone was enough to prompt further examination. Linguists pointed out that the two words shared similar phonetic structures. Both relied on nasal consonants. Both required minimal adjustment of tongue placement. This similarity meant that the alteration could pass unnoticed by casual listeners. It was, in effect, a change that hid in plain sight, which raised an uncomfortable question. If someone wanted to express something without attracting attention, would they not choose the smallest possible deviation? Still, speculation is not analysis, and analysis demands restraint. Rather than assuming intention, we considered psychological conditions under which symbolic expression emerges. When individuals feel constrained, monitored, or unable to communicate directly, indirect language becomes more common. This is well documented in both clinical psychology and sociolinguistics. Dreams become vivid. Metaphors increase. Creative output shifts toward ambiguity. Art becomes a container for what cannot be said aloud. In this light, the lyric alteration did not appear as a message, but as a symptom. Not a declaration, but a fracture. A moment where internal conflict briefly disrupted external control. Additional elements began to draw attention. Visual motifs repeated across unrelated posts. Images that on their own appeared meaningless. Together they formed patterns. Not codes in the conspiratorial sense, but personal symbols. The kind individuals return to unconsciously when attempting to process pressure. Observers noted recurring imagery associated with limitation and observation. Eyes, reflections, barriers. Numbers that held private significance, but no public explanation. Again, none of these details proved anything. But they suggested a state of mind shaped by constraint rather than freedom. It is important to emphasize what this analysis does not claim. We are not asserting that the artist was attempting to send a message. We are not suggesting external orchestration. We are not attributing supernatural meaning to coincidence. We are acknowledging a phenomenon familiar to anyone who has lived under sustained pressure. When direct communication feels unsafe, expression finds alternate routes. Music, images, small deviations, unintended signals. What followed was predictable. Online discussions intensified. Interpretations multiplied. Some were thoughtful, others were reckless. The risk of distortion grew alongside visibility. And with that risk came a familiar response. Silence. No clarification was offered. No correction issued. The altered lyric was neither acknowledged nor denied. The recording remained available, unchanged. Official channels remained quiet. This absence of response had a paradoxical effect. Rather than resolving speculation, it reinforced uncertainty. Not because silence confirmed meaning, but because it avoided engagement altogether. We are often taught that ambiguity invites projection, that people see what they want to see. This is true, but ambiguity also invites responsibility, especially when lives are involved. The question then is not whether these symbols were intentional. The question is why no effort was made to contextualize them once they became a focal point of concern. In systems that prioritize stability, unresolved ambiguity is sometimes preferable to clarification. Clarity can introduce complexity. Complexity demands accountability. And accountability disrupts routine. So the symbols remained, untouched, unexplained. And, in the absence of answers, the public did what humans have always done. They searched for meaning, not out of obsession, but out of a fundamental discomfort with unresolved loss. Because when a voice is no longer present to speak for itself, every fragment it leaves behind becomes heavier. Every word matters. Every silence deepens. And sometimes the smallest change carries the greatest weight. When a person is no longer free to speak, even a song can become a confession. When rational explanations reach their limits, human beings do not simply stop searching. Instead, they turn inward. They look for structure where facts fall short, and for continuity where loss has disrupted order. This is not superstition. It is anthropology. In the weeks following the artist's death, something unusual but deeply human began to take shape. Acts of remembrance emerged without coordination. No single organizer. No unified message. Only repetition. Candles. Quiet gatherings. Shared moments of stillness. These rituals did not attempt to explain what had happened. They did something else. They acknowledged that something had been broken. Across cultures, ritual serves a specific function in moments of unresolved loss. It provides a boundary, a threshold between what was and what must continue. Without such boundaries, grief has no shape. It lingers indefinitely, turning inward, often destructively. One tradition that drew particular attention was the observance of 100 days after death. In many East Asian belief systems, this period marks a symbolic transition, not for the dead alone, but for the living. Mourning, which initially demands expression, gradually gives way to acceptance. Tears are not forbidden, but they are no longer central. Life is expected to resume, altered, but ongoing. In theory, this moment is meant to close a chapter. In practice, it rarely does when questions remain unanswered. What unfolded instead was a continuation of attention rather than its release. People gathered not to summon spirits or seek supernatural signs, but to sit with the absence itself. To recognize that their discomfort was shared. That they were not alone in sensing something unresolved. From a psychological perspective, this response is neither mysterious nor irrational. Collective grief often intensifies when an individual's death resonates with broader anxieties. The loss becomes symbolic. Not because the individual was a hero or a martyr, but because their story reflects a vulnerability many recognize in themselves. Pressure without voice. Expectation without agency. Visibility without safety. In such context, spirituality does not function as belief in the unseen. It functions as language, a way to articulate what logic alone cannot fully contain. We observed this in the way people spoke about energy, presence, and connection. These terms were not used precisely, nor were they meant to be. They operated as metaphors. Expressions of emotional resonance rather than metaphysical claims. When individuals say they feel a presence, they are often describing continuity. When they speak of energy, they are describing impact. When they speak of awakening, they are describing recognition. The recognition that a system can harm without intending to. The recognition that silence can spread pain invisibly. The recognition that forgetting is sometimes easier than understanding. What made this case distinct was not the presence of ritual, but its persistence. The refusal to let the story dissolve quietly into memory. This persistence did not manifest as protest or accusation. It manifested as remembrance. There is an important distinction here. Anger seeks resolution through confrontation. Remembrance seeks resolution through acknowledgement. One demands answers. The other demands integrity. Those who participated in these acts of remembrance did not claim certainty. They did not claim insight into hidden mechanisms. They claimed something simpler, that a life had ended under circumstances that did not feel complete, and that completeness in the absence of explanation must be sought elsewhere. From a sociological standpoint, this is how communities process unresolved trauma. They create shared spaces for ambiguity. They allow contradiction to exist without forcing premature closure. This does not mean the truth is spiritual in nature. It means the human response to uncertainty often is. We must also consider what these rituals say about the observers themselves. The discomfort they expressed was not limited to this case alone. It extended outward, toward broader questions about vulnerability in public life, about the cost of silence, about the systems we participate in without fully examining their impact. In remembering him, people were also interrogating their own thresholds. How much pressure would they endure before speaking? How long would they remain silent if silence promised safety? These are not abstract questions. They are deeply personal, and they are not resolved by facts alone. The final and perhaps most unsettling aspect of this collective response is what it suggests about closure. Closure is often portrayed as a necessary endpoint, a goal to be achieved. But in reality, closure imposed too quickly can function as erasure. Some stories require time. Some wounds require space. Some questions must remain open until those affected are ready to face the answers. As we step back and look at this case in its entirety, we are left not with a conclusion, but with a mirror. One that reflects not only the circumstances of a single death, but the conditions under which we, as a society, decide what is acceptable to leave unexplained. Perhaps the most important question is not whether the truth will ever be fully known. Perhaps the most unsettling question is not what happened to him, but what this silence reveals about us. Perhaps the most unsettling question is not what happened to him, but what this silence reveals about us. Some stories conclude with answers. Timelines align. Evidence settles. Responsibility is assigned. The audience is released from uncertainty. This is not one of those stories. What remains after examining the silence, the symbols, and the rituals is not clarity, but awareness. An understanding that certain systems do not require malice to produce harm. They require only structure, pressure, and enough people willing to endure quietly. The artist at the center of this case did not leave behind a manifesto. He did not accuse. He did not expose. What he left behind was absence. And absence, when it arrives without explanation, carries a weight that words cannot replace. We often assume that justice must arrive in visible forms. Investigations, verdicts, public reckoning. These are important mechanisms, but they are not the only ones. Sometimes, justice begins as refusal. A refusal to forget. A refusal to accept incomplete narratives simply because they are convenient. Remembering is not passive. To remember is to acknowledge discomfort, to sit with unresolved questions rather than forcing them into neat conclusions, to resist the instinct to move on simply because time has passed. In this case, the persistence of attention was not driven by spectacle. It was driven by recognition. The recognition that many individuals live under conditions where silence feels safer than honesty, where opportunity depends on compliance, where speaking freely carries consequences that are never explicitly stated yet universally understood. The discomfort surrounding this story did not come from hidden facts. It came from familiarity. We recognize the pressure. We recognize the restraint. We recognize the cost of being visible without protection. And perhaps that is why this loss resonated beyond personal connection. Because it reflected a dynamic many have experienced in quieter forms. In workplaces, in relationships, in systems that reward endurance over expression. Closure in such cases is often misunderstood. It is not the erasure of pain. It is not the certainty of explanation. It is the willingness to hold complexity without denial. As observers, we are not tasked with solving this case. We are tasked with listening to what it reveals. About silence, about vulnerability, about the environments we help sustain through our participation. The story does not ask us to choose sides. It asks us to examine conditions. Because the most enduring impact of a life is not measured by fame or productivity. It is measured by the questions left behind. The ones that continue to surface long after official narratives have settled. And if there is a responsibility that emerges from this story, it is not to speculate endlessly, nor to accuse without cause. It is to remain attentive, to notice when silence becomes normalized, to recognize when absence is dismissed too quickly. Some stories end with answers. Others end with a responsibility to remember.